So thank you, Isabel, for the presentation, and congratulations on the report. Absolutely, I think it's a tremendous effort and something that we haven't really seen. It's a unique publication within this type of publication. So if we take a look at other reports that provide international comparative snapshots or analysis of social protection, they tend to focus on particular subsections of social protection systems. So you'll find reviews on social safety nets, on cash transfers within social safety nets. We find reviews of old age pensions. But here we're looking at a report that actually covers very comprehensively the full spectrum of social protection interventions. So to include, yes, social assistance, but also contributory-based social insurance, labor market-related social protection interventions, and health-related interventions, a whole host of interventions. But more importantly, perhaps, is also the way in which this information is reported, which is around the life events and contingencies that affect all of us, or certainly most of us, over the course of our lifetimes. And this is absolutely crucial. So what, as you mentioned in your presentation, you're reporting information around events such as, you know, maternity, ill health, old age, that will affect a lot of us over the course of our lifetimes. Why does this matter? This matters because in some circles, and certainly in the international development context, the discussion on social protection still tends to focus on social protection interventions in terms of their focus on reaching the poorest of the poor. And this exclusivity, an exclusive focus on this function of social protection, can be very limiting. It tends to restrict our understanding of social protection in terms of safety nets, in terms of often very minimalist or residualist types interventions. And of course we know that that is not social protection. That's a part of social protection. It's often a very small part of social protection. Social protection is much more than that. And it's important to keep this in mind because of the implications in terms of sustainability and impact that this has. Social protection can have a much wider impact if we adopt a broader approach around our understanding of social protection interventions. And we know why this is. I mean, there are a number of examples linked, for instance, around the question of sustainability. We know that very narrowly targeted minimalist type social safety nets tend to enjoy weaker public support, are among the first programs to be cut in the events of fiscal consolidation or public spending cuts. So it's important in terms of also services, if we consider the development of social protection and related services, when these are narrowly targeted or just focusing on the poorest of the poor, they tend to be poorer services, as Amartya Sen and many others have written about. So we do need to take a much broader, more universal approach, and this report does precisely that. Related to this approach, what's interesting is also the linkages to the financing concerns. And here too, this is something that the report does well. It brings out, as you've mentioned now rather quickly in the concluding part of your presentation, the question of financing and revenue for social protection spending. And this is an important issue which partly has been not entirely addressed very well in the past, partly because the focus has been a lot on understanding the impacts, and also the distributional impacts of social spending and social protection. But of course, ideally, we want to know much more, including on the revenue side, for two reasons, well, for many reasons, but two reasons I'll mention here. One is around sustainability, because it's all very well to know that social protection is effective, and we now have a lot of evidence, thanks to many very rigorous impact evaluations, on the potential impacts of specific interventions on a range of outcomes. And that's all very well, but we also know that this effectiveness will depend over time on the possibility of ensuring that these programs are funded and sustained over time. So we do want to know where will the revenue come from to ensure that these programs and policies are developed and are sustained over time. So there's a sustainability issue. There's also an issue around understanding the net impact of policy. Again, so an exclusive attention on the distribution of spending only provides a partial picture. So we've seen, for instance, we have some very good evidence now some of it very impressive, of the incidence and distributional effects of social protection spending. And for some countries, particularly some middle-income countries, you see some very impressive results. So you see very progressive distribution of social assistance transfers and some very impressive impacts on income poverty and income inequality of social transfers more broadly, including social insurance transfers in some cases. And that's, that's great news. On the other hand, this only provides a partial picture. And we do want to know more about the net effects of policy. This means taking the financing angle into account. This is work that ODI with DFID is now carrying out, but also others. So factoring in the incidence and distributional impact of the financing side. In particular, when we look at countries that are relying on domestic resources to fund their social protection, we find that in some countries, for instance, once you factor in the incidence of taxes, these may, in some cases, partly offset some of the redistributive effect of social protection spending. And this is exactly the kind of information we want to know more about. I think one of the clear messages that emerges from the report is the extent to which we've seen an expansion of social protection. If we take a step back and adopt this historic view, it's very impressive over the course of the 20th century, the adoption of legislation, regulation, and beyond legislation, then also the implementation, gradual implementation of social protection on the ground, which on the one hand is extraordinary. At the same time, the report flags very well the concerns related with, associated with the cuts that are following on from the recent shocks. However, from a historic perspective, we still are in a fairly unique situation because of exactly what you described, not only in the report, but in other work that you've done, that shows that, for instance, in the immediate instance following the recent 2008 shocks and thereafter, many countries did not respond with an immediate cut of social protection spending, and some effort was made to try and protect social spending, and certainly to ring-fence and protect social protection spending. And this reflects an understanding that of the potential role that social protection can play in acting as a shock absorber, as an automatic stabilizer, which is indeed one of the primary or one of the objectives of social protection. So again, I see great potential in terms of the recognition of the potential role that social protection can play in these contexts. Just to conclude, the closing section of the report makes the case very strongly for including social protection in the post-2015 agenda. And it lists the range of impacts, as you have partly done here as well, that social protection has on reducing poverty, reducing inequality, promoting education, health outcomes, promoting employment and economic growth. And here, I mean, to be fair, the section is very brief. It's about 2 pages, and some references and examples are provided that support these claims. On the other hand, it provides minimal information on what it is about social protection intervention, so what features or design and implementation details that actually ensure that these impacts are achieved and that social protection is indeed effective in securing progress towards these objectives. Because the issue here is, of course, that both if you look at the theoretical literature, but also at empirical evidence, there are claims, very different claims also around the potential negative effects of social protection, including around, I mean, the most common obvious ones are around potential labor supply effects of social assistance, you know, the usual work disincentive effects, but also at a more macro level, the concerns of the connections between high levels of social protection spending and macroeconomic trends. These were not raised in the report and were not addressed. Having said that, we have ample evidence. There's a vast literature now that has tackled precisely these kinds of concerns. And I think that as all of us, as working on social protection, both as researchers but as policy advisors, need to do more work around identifying and conveying, transmitting more information around these details in order to ensure that social protection fulfills its full potential in reducing poverty and inequality.
Thanks, Francesca. I'm going to hand straight over to Sam.